All right, good evening, everyone. We will start 2 minutes early. Excellencies, lords, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this event that we're doing here on the battle for Normandy tonight. I'm Karen von Hippel, the director here, and it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight. We are obviously commemorating the Normandy landings a bit before the official ceremonies, because we thought we would be able to gather an audience, actually, if we did it in advance. But for those of you who do not know RUSI, we were founded in 1831 by the Duke of Wellington. We're the world's oldest defense and security think tank. And while we today focus on very modern defense and security issues, we are also very proud of our history. And we're very proud of our library with a very extensive military history collection upstairs. I'm sure many of you have seen it. We also regularly host events on military history like this one today and write about it in our journal. And we have relaunched our book prize. We have an annual book prize for the best book in the English language on military history, the Duke of Wellington Prize, and we're really delighted that the 9th Duke of Wellington, who is a trustee, is a sponsor of that book prize. I think all of us would agree that in these very uncertain times that it is important, obviously, to focus and reflect on history and on critical historical events and the lessons learned, the lessons not learned from these times. And of course, D-Day is one such event. We're very excited in this room to have so many experts on D-Day, on the Second World War, and we're looking forward to hearing from you in the Q&A. But I'd also like to extend a very special welcome to our three distinguished guests in the front row, in pensioners Roy Cadman, George Skipper, and John Honey, who are all from the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. And can you please all join me in welcoming them tonight? I'd also like to thank our very distinguished panel. Gill Bennett will be chairing this event. Thank you to Sir Antony Beevor, Major General Mungo Melvin, and we are hoping Professor David Reynolds will be joining us soon. I'd also like to thank the Normandy Memorial Trust for their cooperation, and in particular, Lord Ricketts, who's the chairman, and General the Lord Dannett, who's a trustee and sitting in the front row. So thank you for your support for tonight's event. I also want to thank my two colleagues, Neil Watling and Paul Summerfield, who have been working very, very hard on tonight's event to ensure it's a success. So before I hand over to Gill, we wanted to show you a very short video clip that my colleague Tom Ascott made at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, and it features Trooper Roy Cadman, who is in the front row. He served in 3 Commando 1st Special Service Brigade, and he will be vividly recounting his arrival on D-Day at Sword Beach. So please join us.
The war was on, and I was my 17th birthday, and I thought if I wait till I'm 18, I'm going to miss it all. I had a letter after about a week, so I took it home. My mother and my father didn't know anything about it. My mother was crying her eyes out, and my father said, "It'll do him good." I thought, "Oh, you bloody..." And I volunteered for the commandos. I had to go in front of an officer, a commando officer. He said, "You've got a very good record." He said, "You're just the sort of lad we want." They brought us back for D-Day when we got up to Italy. They brought us back for D-Day. We had a lot of recruits because we were down from 430 strong down to, I think it was 49. That's all. And our task was to land on Sword Beach, Queen Ret'd, and we were up on deck as we're coming in. We were about 300 yards off. They got a direct hit on the rear. Everybody in it, 34 of our lads, killed outright. Because you've got to realise what that beach looked like. all barbed wire, posts, all iron posts, three angled, and a landmine on top, and they were plonked in about every 30 or 40 yards, and there's all the shit coming down onto the beach from our battleships and cruisers, and you can't, I can't describe it. The noise and the flames. It was a case of we were the only ones there and we had to do it. I mean, these people had to be beaten. We went ashore with the green berry, everybody else had tin hats. We battled our way through. There was 3 or 4 one of these big concrete bunkers with slits in it, with spandos sticking out. Because our objective was to meet the 6th Airborne who captured Pegasus Bridge. We were in such a state that we couldn't go any further. We hadn't got enough men. We go out there now and we're heroes. Really, bloody heroes. Wherever we go, we lay the wreath and we stand back and we both salute. And I say, they shall not grow old as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them or the years condemn. In the morning and at the going down of the sun, we will remember them.
Thank you very much. Very prophetic words. Thank you. Gill.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I'm very honoured to have been asked to chair this event, Reflections on D-Day, the Battle for Normandy. Though it is 75 years to go, I know that everyone here tonight has the events of that days. Those days have an immediate resonance. Many of you know a great deal about them. Quite a few people here have written about them. But for the wider population in Britain, they also have a resonance, a place in emotional as well as military memory, in the context of a war that remains generally a subject of keen general interest. And of course, there are a wide variety of events, a lot of media coverage and commemorations which will take place in the coming week. However, you will have found on your chairs indications of new research carried out by YouGov Cambridge for the RUSI Defence Attitudes Project, which shows that many British people don't really know what D-Day was. They're aware of it rather vaguely as a turning point in the Second World War. And although 83% of those surveyed endorsed Britain's involvement in the war, in fact, after 1945 is the only war, apart from the Falklands, which most people thought we should have been involved in, but less than half the people surveyed knew that D-Day was the beginning of the Allied liberation of Europe, or which countries contributed troops to the invasion forces. In fact, quite a few people thought that D-Day was the end of the war itself. Now, in a sense, this isn't surprising that you always get these kind of results with historical surveys. But they do show how important it is that we keep talking, writing and examining the events of 1944 and their legacy, even as the number of veterans is naturally dwindling, though it's very nice to have these gentlemen here with us. And tonight's event, with contributions from an eminent panel, more than fulfills that obligation. Now, before I hand over to our speakers, I have just 3 very brief points I would like to make with my own historian's hat on about D-Day and the Battle for Normandy. The first is the importance of seeing that extraordinarily complex operation in the wider context, of course, of global war. Of course, that context was the reason why the invasion plan took so long to agree and so long to plan. But the invasion would have been a different matter without victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, or the hard-won victories by the Red Army in 1943, and other campaigns such as Tito's successes in Bosnia, the Burman campaign, of course, and the Allied campaign in Italy were all part of the story that we must not forget. The second element is deception. And I'm not talking here just about the elaborate plans drawn up to persuade Hitler that the Allied forces would land in the Pas-de-Calais. Also crucial to Allied success was the parallel deception planned by the Soviet High Command, Operation Bagration, which persuaded the Germans that a Soviet attack on their forces in Belarusia would come from the south at the end of the summer of 1944, or rather from the north just after D-Day, which it did. And this all meant that in May 1944, German forces did not know just who they would be facing on the east or western front, when or where they would attack. Soviet deception is rarely mentioned, but it was important. And thirdly, the role played by intelligence, by the use of German agents turned by MI5 in the double-cross system, by the code-breakers of Bletchley Park, whose work on cracking Enigma was helped by the capture of a U-boat only 2 days before D-Day, and by the valuable work done by Polish intelligence obtaining details of V weapons, which included on the 20th of May 1944 capturing an entire V2 rocket, dismantling it, and somebody bicycling it across to a Polish airstrip. Now, all three of these things are just something we should not forget. But I want to leave you with a very brief quotation from Alan Brooke's diaries, which I know a lot of you here will be familiar with, but I always like this one, where he says, "I never again want to go through a time like the present one." This is the week before D-Day. "The cross-channel operation is just eating into my heart. I wish to God we could start and have done with it." Now, you're probably thinking the same now, so I'm going to stop talking. Tonight's presentations and the Q&A are all on camera and on the record, so please remember that. And I'm now going to introduce our speakers, at least the first two. I will introduce David too, because I'm sure that Professor Reynolds will be coming. First of all, our first speaker, Sir Antony Beevor, renowned historian of war and military matters, author of many books, including Crete, The Battle and the Resistance, Stalingrad, Arnhem, Berlin, The Downfall, and, of course, D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, which won the Prix Henri Malherbe and the RUSI Westminster Medal. So Antony is going to set the D-Day scene for us tonight. On my left, Major General Mungo Melvin, a senior associate fellow of RUSI, who retired from the British Army in 2011 after leading the MOD's Enhancing Strategic Capability Study and, at the same time, directing the Strategic Studies Cell at the Royal College of Defence Studies. Major General Melvin's books include Manstein, Hitler's Greatest General, and Sevastopol's Wars, Crimea from Potemkin to Putin. And he is going to speak about the doctrinal and organisational legacy of the Battle for Normandy. And finally, Professor Reynolds, Professor of International History and Fellows, Christ's College, Cambridge, one of our most eminent historians, and a specialist on among other things on the Anglo-American relationship, who recently published The Kremlin Letters, Stalin's Wartime Correspondence with Churchill and Roosevelt, and will publish in November a new book, Island Stories, Britain and Its History in the Age of Brexit. And he, when he arrives, is going to talk about the liberation of Nazi Europe and the subsequent effect on the project of European integration, in particular the effect on the French, who felt rather marginalised about D-Day. But with no further ado, I would like to ask Sir Antony Beevor to begin our session.
Gill, thank you very much indeed. Having been asked to set the scene and the strategic background for D-Day in just 13 minutes, this brief talk will be simplistic and schematic, but I hope at least it will stimulate some discussion afterwards. Let's start by running quickly through the turning points in the Second World War. Always a fairly subjective subject, but here are mine. The first, I would argue, is Churchill's refusal of Halifax's proposal at the end of May 1940, when the British Army appeared trapped in the Dunkirk pocket, that Britain should at least find out what peace terms Hitler might offer. It's probably the only moment when Hitler stood a chance of winning the war outright. As for the recent film Darkest Hour, both the director and the scriptwriter should have been arraigned for crimes against history. The geopolitical turning point, however, came in December 1941 with the Wehrmacht's failure to destroy the Red Army in front of Moscow and, above all, Hitler's declaration of war on the United States. From that point on, it is very hard to see Nazi Germany or Japan capable of defeating the coalition of the Soviet Union, the United States and Britain, along with other allies. The first part, though, of 1942 was disastrous for the Allies almost everywhere. But the psychological turning point of the whole war came soon afterwards, that autumn, with the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad and, on an incomparably smaller scale, Rommel's retreat from Alamein. The Germans had passed their cumulative point. They had overstretched themselves and lost both momentum and the initiative. The Japanese, meanwhile, had overstretched themselves even more rapidly, in fact, in just 7 months from their initial attack on Pearl Harbor. In any case, Paulus's surrender at the end of January 1943 told the world and everyone in Germany, except the most devoted Hitler loyalists, that the war would now undoubtedly end in Berlin. Some still cite the Battle of Kursk in July and August 1943 as the turning point of the war, but in my view this is much too late. The significance of D-Day today, on the 75th anniversary, lies in its role of liberating Western Europe. But we should remember, as Gill pointed out, that during the mid-period of the war, the second front of the cross-channel invasion was most heavily marked by its relationship to the Eastern Front. In April 1942, Roosevelt, afraid that the Red Army might still collapse, promised Stalin a second front without consulting Churchill. There were no American troops then in Britain to help honour this pledge. Yet Operation Sledgehammer was offered to Molotov, and this would supposedly involve sending some 100,000 troops to the Cherbourg or Cotentin Peninsula, almost certainly a disastrous project at the extreme range of fighter cover. It would hardly serve its purpose of attempting to divert German troops from the Eastern Front, since even a handful of German divisions could have bottled up any force landed there. Not surprisingly, both Churchill and General Sir Alan Brooke did all they could to prevent such an operation taking place. It's still not entirely clear whether the American Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, really believed in Sledgehammer or was simply using it as a means to force the British to commit to an invasion of northern France. Marshall rightly suspected that Churchill's plans lay in other directions. Later in the year, Marshall was horrified by Roosevelt's readiness to concede to Churchill's demand for landings in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, and the fundamental difference between British traditional strategy and American strategy was starting to open up. Ever since the 18th century, Britain, as a small island nation, had always preferred a peripheral strategy. This meant using the Royal Navy to wear down a numerically superior opponent, especially in the Mediterranean, before tackling his armies on the European mainland with coalition warfare. The Americans, on the other hand, believed in a continental strategy, a massive clash of land forces to destroy the enemy head-on. The high point of British influence in Allied councils came at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, when Roosevelt allowed the invasion of Sicily as the next step. But by November 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Roosevelt had sided with Stalin's insistence that the Western Allies should invade France and attack Germany through northern Europe. Stalin was in a virtually impregnable position. The victory at Stalingrad had given the Soviet Union superpower status, and nobody had twisted the sense of blood guilt more in Western minds than Stalin, harping on about the monstrous losses of the Red Army, which dwarfed Allied casualties. Roosevelt's compromises to the British were at an end. This meant Churchill's dream of advancing into Central Europe from northeast Italy to preempt a Soviet occupation was doomed. It was never a sound plan, though. The mountainous terrain around the Ljubljana Gap would have made that impossible. And the Allies, exceptionally slow and bitter advance up the spine of Italy over the next 2 years showed how effectively the Germans could fight in retreat. There are those today who try to argue that the invasion of northern France should have been launched in 1943, that this extra year of Allied operations in northwest Europe, they say, would have prevented the Soviet occupation of Central Europe. But in the late spring of 1943, the U-boat threat had not been defeated, the back of the Luftwaffe had not yet been broken by the long-range fighters escorting American bombers, and both the commanders and men of the US Army needed more battle experience before confronting the German army on the continent. Churchill was wrong to joke that the Americans always came up with the right solution in the end, having tried everything else first. The Americans, in fact, were far quicker to learn than the exceedingly conservative British Army. Maybe something which Mungo will be covering later. Churchill had been humiliated on various occasions by Stalin, railing so bitterly at his Western allies over all the postponements of the Second Front. It was always Churchill who had to be the bearer of bad tidings to Stalin on the subject, not Roosevelt. Stalin, of course, had not been concerned about the cross-channel operation turning into a bloodbath. To divert Wehrmacht forces from the Eastern Front, he simply believed it was his right to demand a similar sacrifice from Western forces as he had imposed himself on the Red Army. But at Tehran, at the end of 1943, it was Roosevelt's turn to be embarrassed, because he had not yet decided on the supreme commander for the invasion. Stalin made it clear that he found it hard to believe they were serious about a cross-channel invasion if they had not yet chosen the commander. Roosevelt, unable to do without Marshall in Washington, appointed Eisenhower as soon as they returned to Cairo. And by the start of 1944, Churchill had to conceal his reluctance and pretend to support the cross-channel invasion, even though he still tried, without success, to defend the importance of the Italian front. Only once the Allies were successfully ashore on the Normandy coast would the Soviet leader admit to any respect for Operation Overlord. In the whole history of war, he acknowledged to Churchill, there has never been such an undertaking. Meanwhile, on the German side, the law of unintended consequences had been at work. Their defeat of the disastrous Dieppe raid in August 1942 had convinced Hitler and the OKW, the High Command, that the Allied invasion could be easily repulsed. Resources were constantly diverted from the so-called Atlantic Wall. German commanders did not agree with the optimism at Führer headquarters. Generalfeldmarschall von Rundstedt described the Atlantic Wall as just a bit of cheap bluff, and Generalfeldmarschall Rommel was equally dubious. Rommel first used the phrase, the longest day, to emphasize the fact that the Germans' only chance of defeating the invasion existed in the first 24 hours. He realized that once the Allies were properly established ashore, then the Germans were bound to lose in the end. The Allies' massive air support would smash up any major counterattack. He later admitted that even he had underestimated the effectiveness of naval artillery from the ships anchored offshore, which proved devastating. But Rommel's own determination to deploy panzer divisions close to the coast to win the battle on the first day was opposed by Rundstedt, Generaloberst Guderian, and General der Panzertruppen Georg von Schreppenberg. They wanted to hold their panzer divisions back, concealed in the forests close to Paris, ready to charge north to the Pas-de-Calais or northwest to Normandy. In the event, it was Hitler who insisted on controlling them from the Berghof above Berchtesgaden. But his staff feared to wake him on the crucial morning of the invasion. The German infantry divisions in the 7th Army defending Normandy were almost all under strength, underarmed, undertrained, and lacking in transport. They were simply not strong enough to withstand the Allied bombardments and attacks. As a result, the panzer divisions, to the horror of their commanders, could not be used in the single great counterattack. They had to be split up among the infantry to act as corset stiffeners, purely to prevent an Allied breakthrough. This, of course, prevented a British and Canadian breakout and rapidly turned the invasion into a battle of attrition. General Montgomery had refused to listen to the pre-invasion warning of Cossack, Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, the original planner of Operation Overlord, that the Germans were bound to concentrate their panzer forces against the British on the eastern flank near Caen. This was because if the Allies managed to break through there towards Falaise and Paris, then the bulk of Rommel's forces to the west and on the Atlantic coast would be cut off. As a result of this German counter-pressure on his front, Montgomery's plan to seize Caen and the land beyond to provide airfields for the RAF never stood a chance. By the 10th of June, just 4 days after D-Day, the Allies and the Germans both found themselves stymied in this battle of attrition. And this was when Montgomery suddenly decided that his master plan was to tie the Germans down on the left to allow the Americans to break out on the right. So was there something wrong with the planning? Was Montgomery's objective of taking Caen on the first day feasible? General Dempsey, the army commander, was highly dubious. Or did Montgomery deliberately set too ambitious an objective purely to try to push his commanders on forwards? This is still not clear because Montgomery said so many contradictory things, largely, I suspect, because he wanted to be able to say afterwards that things had turned out exactly as he had planned. And why did Montgomery decide to smash Caen to rubble with heavy bombers when that would turn it into an ideal defensive zone for the defenders and block access to the attackers? Surely the lessons of Stalingrad, bombed by the Luftwaffe, showed how a ruined cityscape could be turned into a killing zone for the attackers. If the bombing of Caen was simply part of the interdiction plan to slow the arrival of German reinforcements, then it certainly suggests that Montgomery did not expect to take Caen that rapidly. Clarity in setting objectives is surely one of the key duties of generalship. We think of the fighting in Normandy as a desperate struggle between the Americans and British on the one side and the Germans on the other. But at a time when international alliances are undervalued or even derided, it is worth emphasizing that D-Day and the Battle for Normandy was the most multinational clash of the whole of the Second World War. On D-Day itself, the invading and bombarding forces did not just consist of British and American formations and units. Warships and other vessels came from many Allied countries: Canada, France, Poland, Norway, Greece, South Africa, the Netherlands and Belgium. Squadrons of aircraft overhead were manned by Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, Rhodesians, Poles, French, Belgians, Dutch and Norwegians. The crew of Coastal Command's 224 Squadron, one of the many guarding against U-boat attempts to come round from the Bay of Biscay to attack the invasion fleets, contained no less than 9 nationalities, including a Swiss and 2 South Americans. Both a French and a Polish armoured division would take part in the desperate fighting to close the Falaise pocket in August, and later Dutch, Belgian and Czech formations would join the advance east. Within the Wehrmacht, meanwhile, non-Germans had been forced into units defending the Atlantic Wall, including many taken prisoner from the Red Army on the Eastern Front. In one book I recounted the story of a Korean called Yang Kyung-jong, who had been conscripted by the Japanese into their Kwantung Army in Manchuria in 1938. A year later, he was captured by the Red Army after the Battle of Khalkhin Gol and sent to a labour camp. In 1942, he was drafted along with thousands of other prisoners into the Red Army forces. And then early in 1943, he was taken prisoner by the German army at the Battle of Kharkov in Ukraine. Finally, in June 1944, now in German uniform, he was captured by American paratroopers at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, inland from Utah Beach. After a time in a prison camp in Britain, he went to the United States, where he said nothing of his past. He settled there and finally died in Illinois in 1992. In a war which killed more than 60 million people and had stretched around the globe, this reluctant veteran of the Japanese, Soviet and German armies had actually been comparatively fortunate. Thank you very much.
My Lords, ladies and gentlemen, great privilege to be here this evening, particularly in presence of our veterans. Well, my purpose this evening is not to describe in any detail the actions of the British Army and Canadians at D-Day or the Normandy campaign, but rather to draw some of the hard-fought, hard-won lessons on this second front, which made their mark to a large degree on the post-war army. And my main topics are doctrine, organisation and equipment, and to these two must be added. Firstly, morale, and secondly, Montgomery, the dominating personality of the campaign, who also influenced much of the British Army's immediate post-war thinking and structure. Now, the British Army of 1944, as it hit the beaches D-Day on the 6th of June, possessed a high-level doctrine, field service regulations, and on the face of it, that should have been adequate for much of what it did, alongside, on the other side, the German Truppenführung of 1933. But really crucially for both sides, and this is also for the Russians and also for the Americans, that neither side had really specified in their doctrine the details of the necessary infantry armoured cooperation. The experiences of the German Blitzkrieg of 1939 to 41, the Desert War, on both sides, and particularly for the Germans on the Eastern Front, pointed to a more flexible approach to grouping and fighting infantry and armour together, closely supported by artillery and engineers. Now, the German term for this combat grouping of what's known now as combined arms was a Kampfgruppe or battle group, and which to be found all over the German army on all fronts. I think it's fair to say, though some would criticise this point, the revisionists, that British organisational practice and tactical procedures in this narrow field of armoured infantry integration generally, but not always, lagged Germany's on the 6th of June. But much would change during the campaign. In his outspoken autobiography, Out of Step, Field Marshal Carver, who commanded a brigade for much of the campaign, noted there had been much discussion before D-Day about how the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, should be grouped for battle. In the end, they didn't change their organisation and painfully would learn how to do it. It took a combination of costly offensive operations, trying to break through the German defence at Epsom in late June and more particularly Goodwood in mid-July 1944, to confirm that the armoured brigade, whether integral to the division or independent, needed more infantry, and the complementary infantry brigades and the armoured divisions needed more armour. And one of the principal problems encountered during this Operation Goodwood, a massive corps-level tank attack involving no fewer than three British armoured divisions, launched south of Caen, led to a very expensive battle. The Germans were able to knock out no fewer than 300 British tanks, which is more than we field today, in 3 days. Now, the Germans had developed their Kampfgruppe, but it must be said that they were more successful in defence than in their counterattacks, which largely were obliterated by a combination of Allied air or by British artillery, whether land-based or naval gunfire support, which was very important for D-Day and thereafter. Now, I must raise a flag here about terminology. Following the Second World War, and it remains so to this day, the British Army, in my view, and I'll come off the fence here, erroneously institutionalised the term battle group as being built round either an armoured regiment or infantry battalion. And this reflected neither the British practice nor the German during the war. Significantly in Normandy, the British Army adapted and started experimenting with pairing tank and infantry units from Operation Bluecoat, 30th of July 1944, onwards, particularly within the Guards and 11th Armoured Divisions, Carver's own 4th Independent Brigade, but also in the Canadian and Polish Armoured Divisions. And I suggest that this approach to battle grouping represents an excellent example of the much vaunted transformation in contact. Carver made the point that these units were inherently flexible, and he wrote after the war that the fighting in northwest Europe had convinced me that the organisation of the brigade into 2 battle groups, each of an armoured regiment and a mobile infantry battalion, was the best one for an armoured brigade, certainly for the majority of operations. And the armoured division in battle, published by 21st Army Group in December 1944 by Montgomery, with a personal introduction sporting a huge signature, B.L. Montgomery, making sure everybody knew it was his document, made it very clear that this kind of grouping, advocated and practiced by Carver, was a recommended approach. So the lessons painfully learned in Normandy should not be forgotten in this regard. And I would argue that the armoured division in battle of 1983, the one I encountered in my career, is in many ways far less compelling than its 1944 predecessor, written when experienced minds were fresh. Now I'll turn now briefly to equipment, which is also equally controversial. And there were 2 big problems for the British Army in Normandy. One was its lack of a hard-hitting tank, and secondly, the lack of an armoured personnel carrier. But things were to change. The German tanks, the Mark V Panthers and Tigers, though there were relatively few of the latter around, became a real bogey to the British Army during the Normandy campaign. The Sherman tanks, equipped with the hard-hitting 17-pounder gun, were the only tanks, Allied tanks, British tanks, that could take on the Panthers and Tigers on relatively equal terms. The slower, albeit more protected, Churchill tanks fielded a lower velocity, medium velocity gun, and which was good for infantry support, but not good enough for fighting tanks. And it wasn't to the end of the war, when the Comet tank was introduced, and then the Centurion, which arrived too late before the British Army finally fielded a world-class tank. And the Centurion was upgunned, followed by the Chieftain after the war. But crucially, its design emphasis rested on the later wartime imperatives, a lesson from Normandy and Northwest Europe, of firepower, protection, and mobility in that order. Ironically, ladies and gentlemen, matching the infamous Tiger for being underpowered and unreliable. In contrast, the Germans drew quite different lessons from Normandy and other theatres in giving mobility priority over protection in their series of post-war Leopards. Now, I've talked a little bit about the armoured personnel carrier, but again, the Allies improvised here, and for Operation Totalised in August 1944, the Canadian drive towards Falaise was characterised by the first use of the Allies of armoured personnel carriers, so-called kangaroos or turretless tanks. But it wasn't until the 1960s that the British Army of Rhine was equipped with sufficient tracked armoured personnel carriers, and any soldiers here present will remember with affection the Armoured Fighting Vehicle 432, which we retain today. Now, there were also 2 huge success stories for British equipment in Normandy, which I think belies the view that British performance in Normandy was not as good as it should have been. One was of armoured engineers and the other of artillery. Hobart's Funnies, including the amphibious duplex-drive Shermans and the assault vehicles, Royal Engineers and other variants of the Churchill, helped the Allies succeed at D-Day and supported subsequent operations throughout the campaign to good effect. The Germans had absolutely nothing equivalent. Also, it must be stressed that the Royal Artillery proved second to none in Normandy in its ability to switch and mass fires at short notice. Where the British Army could not match the Germans perhaps, and Monty knew this, and he played to the British Army's strengths rather than its weaknesses, couldn't match the Germans in manoeuvre, it could certainly match them in firepower. British infantry weapons proved effective enough, but that said, the Bren light machine guns could not match the much higher power German MG-42s. And indeed, and this was part of the problem of Normandy, Germans in defence, with terrain helping them, were generally at the infantry level better armed than their Allied counterparts. And that's why Allied attacks often failed to bear until overwhelming firepower. Again, a strength, not a weakness in my view. Now here comes, ladies and gentlemen, a really surprising thing. You think Normandy finished in August 1944. It didn't. Normandy lived on, ladies and gentlemen, to the 1980s. Where? Because the British Army resurrected Operation Goodwood of 1944 in planning to defend the Hanover Plain in northern Germany against an envisaged attack. The Goodwood model, exposed on countless Staff College battlefield tours in Normandy, rested on emulating the wartime German defence using a patchwork of Lower Saxon villages as opposed to Norman ones as the bastions of anti-tank defence. And I remember as a young officer this concept being practised with great enthusiasm on Exercise Crusader 1980. But I can honestly say, ladies and gentlemen, I recall thinking then that it all looked a bit odd. The Goodwood concept of 1980 was based on two entirely false premises. First, that the Third Shock Army of 1980, or indeed any other Soviet formation, would fight in a manner similar to the British of 1944. It would not. The Soviet Army had learned its own lessons from the Great Patriotic War, determining that a good proportion of its combat losses had resulted from the inability of unprotected infantry to fight effectively alongside tank units. The result was the post-war series of Soviet-wheeled BTR and tracked BMP vehicles, all well integrated into their tank and motor rifle divisions. Secondly, I would argue that the result of Goodwood of 1944, this great tank attack that failed, was as much a failure of British operational design as execution as of any German tactical or technical prowess. Its adoption in 1980 was a classic example of appreciating the situation to flawed effect. By 1984, the largely static Goodwood concept had been unceremoniously dropped. In its place came a much more mobile defence inspired by General Sir Nigel Bagnall, a design for battle that placed a premium on the armoured counterstroke with artillery and engineers in close support. My final point concerns morale. Montgomery made a great deal of the importance of generating and sustaining high morale in the 21st Army publication of November 1944. A little red booklet called Some Notes on the Conduct of War and the Infantry Division in Battle. And it's worth giving a couple of quotes from this, because it's very much the Monty approach. He stressed, morale is probably the most important single factor in war. It is a pearl of very great price, and the surest way to obtain it is by success in battle. And directly linked to morale was what Montgomery called the human factor, quite a first for a British general at the time, and he wrote, in war, it is the man that counts, and not only the machine. With good men, anything is possible. Success in battle will produce quick results. All soldiers will follow a successful general. Of course, no one had any doubt as to whom Montgomery was referring. For all the criticism that he's attracted both during the Normandy campaign and in the post-war histories, however, there's little doubt in my view that Montgomery did achieve success, albeit hard-fought and hard-won. Rightly, Montgomery emphasised not only firepower, a British strength, but also the importance of what we now call the moral component of fighting power, and a essential requirement to select, train, and look after people, both the leaders and the led, which surely chimes for today. The post-war British Army certainly tried to practice this approach and succeeded, I would argue, to varying degrees. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would assert that the post-war British Army, in which I served for over 37 years, was considerably shaped by the experience of Normandy generally and the Northwest European campaign in terms of doctrine, equipment and organisation. The lessons and its legacy, however, were mixed. While equipment generally improved in quality, if not quantity, and the crucial importance of generating and sustaining high morale in battle remained highlighted, oddly, the British Army failed to codify in practice the more flexible system of tactical employment it had successfully adopted in Normandy. The term battle group manifested itself after the war strictly at the single unit level is a case in point. The British Army today remains one built of units battalions and regiments commanded by lieutenant colonels, and not, as in other armies or formations, commanded by brigadiers and generals. It's what I call the family approach to war. Arguably, it remains most comfortable at the tactical level and in the set-piece battle, which Montgomery did extremely well, and preferably not an attritional one. So, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude, Normandy 75 lives on.
Confident expectation of your arrival.
And I apologise for my late entrance. My brief is to try and take us from 1944 up to the present in terms of the long-term implications of D-Day, and to do that in 13 minutes. So it's slightly a tall order, but I will do my best. And I want to talk about three themes: Russia, the Soviet Union; America, the special relationship; and the relationship with France, referring also to the European community. So you can see where we're gradually moving. And if I have time at the end, I'd like to make a comment about the YouGov poll that I thought was very interesting. First then, the Soviet Union. It is worth emphasising that there were two D-Days in June 1944, a point that has perhaps probably been made but is worth underlining. The 6th of June 1944 is the one that we remember particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada. There is also another D-Day 2 weeks later, on the 22nd of June, which is the opening of the Soviet Union Red Army's major offensive in Byelorussia, codenamed Bagration, after a hero of the War of 1812. And this was part of the deal that was struck between Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill at Tehran. And Stalin followed that through with the intention that Bagration would be complementary to the Allied operation in northwestern Europe. Harmonising the two projects was not easy. Everything about Anglo-Soviet and cooperation during the war was not easy, but it's worth underlining that this was delivered. And delivered with great success. Even while the Allied armies in northwest Europe were still stuck in the bocage in Normandy, the Operation Bagration thrust through with complete surprise Army Group Centre, which had been the bugaboo of the Red Army for 3 years, completely destroying it in a matter of weeks, taking off 28 German divisions from their order of battle and advancing something like 400 miles to the edge of Warsaw. So this was a hugely important offensive. In other words, Hitler's Reich was now being pummeled from east and from west. And this was in many ways the death knell of the Third Reich. Okay, there was a lot of fighting still to be completed before May 1945, but this was a turning point. Yet, of course, this was a mixed blessing in the long term, the Soviet success. Churchill entitled his final volume of memoirs Triumph and Tragedy, capturing that sense that the defeat of Hitler also opened up new problems for Europe and for the future. And they were portended by the way that the Soviet forces on the edge of Warsaw stopped, regrouped, partly for military reasons, but also because Stalin had no intention of assisting the Warsaw Rising and allowing a Polish national government to take control before the Soviets were into a country which, as far as he was concerned, was fundamental to the security of post-war Soviet Union. So triumph and tragedy, the longer story of the Cold War, is foreshadowed in those months in the summer of 1944. Very different story with regard to the Anglo-American relationship, the special relationship. When the Western Front is reopened in Europe, in Western Europe in 1944, 4 years after it had ended at Dunkirk and with the French armistice, it's not an Anglo-French alliance as throughout the First World War. It's essentially an Anglo-American one, and one in which the Americans will inexorably become the senior partners, as Churchill is well aware. 1.5 million American troops are in Britain just before Overlord. In the famous saying, Americans oversexed, overpaid and overhear. Less familiar maybe is the American riposte to that the Brits were undersexed, underpaid and under Eisenhower. And that was the story of the later part of the war, whatever Montgomery wished. But this becomes the basis of British foreign policy for right up to the present day, really. A relationship which is two-way in the 1940s, when Britain is still a world power and has much to contribute to the alliance, not least through bases all over the world, which are important for the United States in the conduct of the Cold War. And that relationship is still immensely important, for example, in the whole intelligence cooperation, which is still a fundamental part of the story. Nevertheless, over time, it became increasingly one-sided because of the growth of American power, and also because of this country, like much of Western Europe's reliance on the American security guarantee because of America's capacity as a nuclear power. And that relationship has been embodied in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has also celebrated anniversary recently, its 70th anniversary, fundamental to the security and foreign policy of this country. So that's the American relationship. The relationship with France is more complex and, in some ways, the most interesting. The alliance in 1940 was ruptured by Dunkirk, by the French armistice. The collapse of France in a matter of weeks, shall we say, effectively the French army collapsed in 4 weeks, whereas from 14 to 18 in the First World War, it held Hitler at bay for 4 years. And this has a hugely damaging effect on the prestige of France, on the image of France, particularly for Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, who basically writes France off as a major power. And one could argue that it has been at the base of French foreign policy right to the present day, right to the Macron era, that need to wipe out the shame of 1940. It's striking that when Churchill's memoirs were translated into French, the French publisher, Plon, used the English titles for all the volumes transliterated into French, except for one on 1940, because, he explained, it is not possible to call a book about 1940 in France their finest hour. So that volume was called Le Tragique. Le Tragique. So when de Gaulle is summoned to Churchill's train outside Portsmouth on the 5th of June 1944 to be told how the Allies were going to liberate his country, what kind of, as he calls it, false currency they were going to impose, their patterns for military rule, he and Churchill had a flaming row. And according to de Gaulle's memoirs, he told Churchill, you must know, Churchill told him that you must know that when we have to choose between Europe and the open sea, we will always choose the open sea. Each time I have to choose between you and Roosevelt, I will choose Roosevelt. De Gaulle repeated that story many times. It's not exactly in that form in the British minutes, but the sense is there. A clear choice, and one where the British would always opt in a crunch position for the Americans. Very different from 1940, and it's worth underlining just what might have happened in 1940 if that Anglo-French alliance had held on. I'm not thinking of the last-ditch attempt at an Anglo-French union in June 1940. That's simply an attempt to stop the French armistice. But the considered view of the Foreign Office by the spring of 1940 is that Britain had made a fundamental mistake to keep the French at arm's length for 20 years and should have committed itself to the security of France. Orme Sargent, who was the Deputy Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, wrote in March 1940 that we need, after this war, once we have defeated Hitler, to construct what he called such a system of close and permanent cooperation between France and Great Britain, political, military and economic, as will for all international purposes make of the two countries a single unit in post-war Europe. That's not a fusion of sovereignties, it's an international alliance, but one in which the two countries are going to operate internationally as one. All that goes up in smoke in May, June 1940. Of course, after the war, there is some attempt to re-establish Anglo-French relations. The Treaty of Dunkirk in 1947, perhaps not the best place to sign that treaty, but anyway. But there is always the sense that the special relationship takes priority. An Interdepartmental Whitehall Committee comments in January 1949, we do have a major interest in European recovery. Failure of Europe to recover spells communism. But the concept must be one of limited liability. In no circumstances must we assist them beyond the point at which our assistance leaves us too weak to be a worthwhile ally for the United States if Europe collapses. Limited liability. And in many ways that has been the attitude of successive post-war governments to the whole European project. Because the French and Germans, of course, drew a very different lesson from 1940. Whereas for us, sovereignty worked, we had survived. For the French and Germans, the horror of what had happened in the Second World War was such as to shake them out of basically 300 years of intermittent war-making and conclude that if you can't beat them, join them. In other words, the Franco-German project was at the heart of European integration and always has been. If this country had had a different view of Europe, in continental Europe in the 1950s, we might have engaged much more with that whole project in its infancy in the 1950s, at a point where we could have shaped the emergence of the European community, probably more in a free trade direction, which was what the Germans, particularly Erhard, German economics minister, would have liked. Instead, the French were left to dictate their terms and to create a community which has always been slanted in their interests and has always been problematic for us. And when we finally joined in 1973, that structure had set firm. And it's not, of course, accidental that our entry was delayed all through the 1960s by two vetoes from General de Gaulle, who had not forgotten the 5th of June 1944. So although you could say that I don't want to take away any of the credit, as it were, for the present mess from people like Mr. Cameron or Mrs. May, nevertheless, I think we do need to allow for a larger historical perspective here. Brexit has roots in the story of the Second World War. But, and this is my final point, but which Second World War? What was striking about that YouGov poll for me was that there is great ignorance of 1944, of what happened. Because it seems to me as a historian that this country has become very fixated with 1940, or our version of it. Now, let's be clear. If this country had capitulated in 1940, the war would have been fundamentally different. The United States would probably have reverted to hemisphere defence. Hitler's chances of rolling up the Soviet Union would have been even greater. So it's fundamental that we stayed on. That was crucial to prevent a total Hitler victory. But we alone were in no position to defeat Hitler. The defeat of Hitler was through an international alliance. one that included the Soviet Union at that stage and was certainly anchored in the United States. And I am concerned that our movie image of the Second World War, the one that is peddled for students and moviegoers and the general public, is very much about a few weeks in 1940, usually painted as Britain alone. It's worth remembering that by the end of 1940, there are 2 Canadian divisions on the North Downs ready to protect London from German invasion. This was never a country that was literally alone. So I think that it is important to remember D-Day in this more holistic sense, because we need to have a broader and more rounded view of our island story as part of a story that has brought in relationships with other nations as part of significant alliances. And I hope that that will be a possible legacy of this kind of event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, I know you'll all agree that those were 3 really rich contributions to our time. Now, this is a very time-limited event, and we are also going to hear shortly from General Lord Dannat. So I'm afraid we have a very, very limited time for questions. So what I'm going to do is ask for maybe 3, but please speak very briefly. Please wait for the microphone and give your name. And please speak to the point and do it as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we won't have time for any questions at all, which would be a pity. So, please. The one here, yes? Yes, this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate all the panelists for their absolutely fantastic presentations. I have a question to Professor Reynolds. As you can tell by my accent, I'm German, and so I would be really interested in what your assessment is in terms of the German view on D-Day versus the 8th of May 1945, in terms of the German, what it means for the German, from a German point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lee, behind you, please.
Thank you. Lee Willett, former RUSI person. Question for Sir Antony, but for everybody, about the issue of unintended consequences that he raised. The airborne drop has been regarded as generally being not that helpful because it was so scattered, but there are 1 or 2 books that say actually it had some unintended positive consequences, even at a very small level. For example, it gave the Germans no real sense of what the centre of gravity for the invasion was, and it also meant the Germans that were used to facing an opponent were surrounded by small groups of paratroopers raiding from all sides, and therefore it had some benefits even if it hadn't gone particularly to plan. I want to welcome your thoughts on those views, please. Thank you.
Fine, thank you. Well, it's not a first of hands. I'm going to ask my colleagues to reply to those 2 questions briefly, please.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you for the question. I'm not a specialist on German view of the war. What I would say is briefly this, that D-Day clearly, in conjunction with the Soviet invasion, Soviet offensive in the East, does have an effect on opinion. I mean, the Stauffenberg plot, the 20th of July, has already been planned, but the urgency of doing it, in the view of the plotters, is accentuated by the clear sense that the Third Reich's days are numbered. On the other hand, there is nothing comparable to the 8th, 9th of May, because it's at that point that the whole of Germany is occupied, that there is an occupation army in Unter den Linden, right in the heart of Germany, of Berlin, which was Roosevelt's deliberate intention. This time it was going to be unconditional surrender, so that there wouldn't be another stab-in-the-back mythology about that, the Second War. So a defeat in France is one thing. Having the enemy army in Berlin is a totally different one.
Thank you.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think above all the way that the Germans, obviously one can never entirely generalise, but I mean the victory over France produced its extraordinary euphoria in Germany, but the announcement of the invasion of the Soviet Union produced absolute horror in Berlin, and I think that there was sort of an instinct. Maybe some of them remembered Bismarck's idea, whatever you do, just don't invade Russia, and of course he was absolutely right on that particular score. I would also just quickly add, on the question of the July plot, I think it's very striking the way that British intelligence completely misanalysed it. They assumed that any army which was trying to blow up its own commander-in-chief must be in a state of disintegration. What, of course, they failed to realise was that the failure to actually kill Hitler at that particular moment meant that the war would carry on until Hitler himself was dead, because now the Nazi Party, Gestapo, and the SS had a total control over the German army. So there was going to be no question of any form of attempt to negotiate as Rommel and others were even thinking about in Normandy. To go back to your point, sir, there was no doubt about it. Yes, the parachute drops all over Normandy did indeed cause total confusion. They had some unexpected bonuses. It made life very difficult, obviously, for particularly the 82nd and also for the 101st Airborne with the scattering. And to a certain degree, obviously, the British 6th Airborne. But it did mean, though, that the Germans had no idea really what was going on. And funny enough, the explosive Puppen, the exploding puppets or dummy paratroopers, also caused a good deal of chaos. People, and especially American historians, with one notable exception, have tended to underestimate the way that actually it was part of the division, which was the 352nd, I think, which was supposed to be inland just from Omaha and also at Omaha, that they sent off their whole reserves off towards investigating those exploding dummies. So from that point of view, it hugely helped the Americans at that crucial moment on Omaha Beach. But yes, war, like politics, has many examples of unintended consequences.
Just add a footnote to what happened on the western flank of D-Day was replicated in the east, and the British Airborne Division drop fatally diverted the German effort and counterattack, which could have gone decisively against, in my view, against Sword Beach or whatever, and it delayed that attack. So, in my view, the airborne operation is absolutely key to unhinging the German defence on D-Day.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop there because we're going to turn now to General the Lord Dannat, former Chief General Staff and trustee of the Normandy Memorial Trust. He's going to introduce a short video clip on behalf of the Normandy Memorial Trust and make a couple of remarks. So, Lord Dannat, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to join, and can I offer my congratulations to the three speakers. I thought that tremendous contributions. I'm trying not to act like the Senior General who sort of tries to wrap things up towards the end, but just 3 points stand out for me from what we've heard so far. A strategic point, that actually one of the lessons that we as a country learnt, that at the end of the Normandy campaign, Montgomery having been the Allied ground commander, never again was the UK the senior partner in a coalition or alliance. We have had to learn progressively since the 1st of September 1944 that we are the junior partner in any coalition or alliance and under American leadership invariably. The second point, I think, is an operational level point. Montgomery gave campaign planning, I think, a very bad name. Did he really dream up his campaign to hold in the left and strike with the Americans in the right? Or did he actually, sitting in his caravan on the 1st of September, think, I better start writing this one up, how it went, and say, that's how I think it was going to go? I think he gave campaign planning a very bad name, an art that we largely forgot, until, as General Mungo mentioned, General Sir Nigel Bagnall, first as Commander 1st British Corps, then of Northern Army Group of NATO, reinvented our thinking at the operational level and got us back into thinking properly about campaign planning and sequencing battles and engagements in a coordinated way to achieve the operational objective that you set yourself. And my third point, again, and Mungo touched on it, we sometimes learn really bad lessons. Epsom and Goodwood were places which we stood in, looking at the way von Luck defended the village of Cagny, and we said, well, when the Third Shock Army comes, this is what we'll do. And as Mungo said, that's complete rubbish. Unfortunately, that rubbish was realised, again, by General Bagnall, Field Marshal Bagnall, when he realised that actually operational level thought, manoeuvre, outmanoeuvring the enemy, both in time and space and thought, was actually a better way than learning those wrong lessons. And my last point, which takes on to the point that I'm actually standing here, is these battles, these campaigns, were all fought by people. 22,442 soldiers, sailors, airmen and marines lost their lives in the Normandy campaign from the 6th of June 1944 to the 1st of September under British command. 22,442 families who lost a loved one, families shattered, servicemen who never came home. We're actually quite good at remembering, but we don't always remember in a very joined-up fashion. In a typical British response, you go to Normandy now, and you'll see this regiment's memorial, you'll see that regiment's memorial, you'll see a 3rd Division, Iron Division memorial, and then you go to Omaha Beach and you see the American National Memorial, you see the Canadian National Memorial, you think, where's the British National Memorial? We haven't had a British National Memorial. This is something I think many of the veterans, surviving veterans, have felt very strongly about. And certainly those who were able to voice their opinions strongly at the 70th anniversary said we've got to do something about it, ideally by the 75th, which was why the Normandy Memorial Trust has been formed. Plans have been drawn up, and at 8:30 French local time next Thursday, the 6th of June, Prime Minister May and President Macron will inaugurate the British National Memorial. I'm going to show you a film in a moment which speaks from the experience of one veteran, his feeling about it, and why such a memorial is necessary. It's a costly project. It's going to cost £29 million. We've got most of it, but not all of it. But I think it's something which we are doing, and doing it right, albeit we're doing it 50 or 60 years too late. Let's have a look at the film.
My name is Harry Billings. I landed on Gold Beach at 6:30 in the morning on 6th of June 44 with a number of fine men. It was either me or them. When I made up my mind, it wasn't going to be me. Everyone around my area had an uncle, a father, a brother, a nephew on that day who never went back home. So many never even got out of the sea. I'm unable to forget about this day. I get so emotional. But believe me, the Battle of Normandy was not easy. Not easy at all. And the sacrifice made was overwhelming. Well, this is where they all landed, and this is where all of them died. Some gave some gave all. And that's what moves me. The war is a terrible thing. I think everybody should know. I can't forget when they bring that memorial up. It'll be worthy of all them poor devils that never came back. And I always think of these fellas. In my heart, this monument means more to me than any other charity I've ever worked with. My generation saved the world.
When the memorial's fully completed, ideally by the 6th of June next year, the names of all those 22,442 will be inscribed on the memorial. Surviving veterans can look and see the names of their friends. Families of veterans can look at their names. And if you stand on the site and look out to sea, to your right you see Gold Beach, where 50th Division, Northumbrian Tyne-Tees Division landed, and to the left you can see the remains of the Mulberry Harbour, where the logistic lifeblood of the campaign came in. There could not be a better site for there to be a national memorial as I say, to be inaugurated at 6:30 next Thursday and then built out completely over the course of the next 12 months. Thank you so much for allowing us to just mention that we're putting right a wrong that we should have done probably quite some time ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Bennett, and I'd just like now to thank all our panellists tonight. I think we've had, many of you, those who know me, know that I have spent over 40 years working as a historian in Whitehall, and I cannot count the number of times that I have said to people, what's the context? It's always my first question, what's the context? And I think that is what really speaks to me from tonight. We've heard a lot of detail and interesting detail, important detail about what actually happened in 1944, but we've also learned about the context and why it still matters now and why it's still with us. And so I'd like you to thank all our panellists for a really interesting evening. Thank you.